They destroyed my bridge at 5 in the morning. No notice, no permits, no chance to defend myself. Just the sound of machinery and the cold voice of the HOA president. That's what happens when people obstruct community progress. She thought she'd just removed the final obstacle to her money-making scheme. She thought my 15-year retirement passion project was just scrap wood in her way. But Serena Blackwood didn't know that in 20 years, as a hydrological engineer, I'd learned one thing. Power-hungry people often forget who actually controls the water. And by the time they remember, it's already too late. Comment your predictions for what happens next. And tell me about your worst HOA experience. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This story actually started 3 weeks earlier on a Tuesday morning that seemed perfectly ordinary. I was Nathan Cross, 58 years old, senior hydrological engineer at the State Water Control Authority, and someone who had spent the better part of 2 decades managing water systems across 3 counties. My mornings always began the same way. Coffee on the back deck of my lake house, watching the mist rise off Pine Lake while the rest of the world still slept. That particular morning felt different. The usual sounds were wrong. Instead of Osprey calling across the water, I heard voices and the distinctive beeping of serving equipment. Through my kitchen window, I spotted them. Serena Blackwood, our HOA president, directing a man with professional GPS gear worth more than most people's cars. The surveyor worked systematically along my shoreline, taking depth readings with sonar equipment and marking coordinates on detailed topographical maps. This wasn't someone checking fence heights or mailbox compliance. This was commercial-level site assessment that suggested major construction planning. I'd had minimal contact with Serena since moving to Pine Lake 15 years ago. She was the type who attended every community meeting, sent detailed emails about property standards, and positioned herself as the neighborhood authority on everything from landscaping choices to dock maintenance. But she'd never shown interest in my corner of the lake, where my hand-built bridge stretched 30 feet from shore into water deep enough for serious fishing. My property was pristine. My bridge constructed to code with all permits properly filed through county offices. The surveyor's equipment was expensive professional-grade technology that costs more than most people's annual salaries. He worked with the precision of someone conducting environmental impact assessments or infrastructure planning rather than routine HOA compliance checks. GPS readings, depth measurements, and topographical mapping suggested someone preparing for significant waterfront construction that would require optimal placement of docks, boat slips, or marina facilities. I pulled out my phone and started recording, applying 20 years of water management experience to document potential regulatory violations. From behind my window, I captured Serena unfolding architectural plans against her luxury SUV while discussing something with the surveyor. The folder in her hands was marked Pine Lake Resort Phase 2 expansion. And when I noticed the Blackwood Development Corporation logo on the surveyor's jacket, the pieces clicked into place with disturbing clarity. The realization hit me like cold water. Serena wasn't just HOA president conducting routine property assessments. She was a corporate developer with business interests that apparently required removing obstacles from Pine Lake's waterfront. My bridge, which had stood peacefully for 15 years without bothering anyone, had become a problem that needed solving for her commercial expansion plans. The surveyor's focus on sightlines and his careful documentation of my bridge's position relative to premium water views told me everything I needed to know about their intentions. A methodical anger settled in my chest as I watched them work. I'd built that bridge with my own hands during early retirement. Every board carefully measured every permit properly obtained through official channels. It represented 15 years of peaceful mornings, quiet evenings, and the satisfaction that comes from creating something lasting with your own craftsmanship. Now, some corporate executive disguised as community leader was treating it like debris that cluttered her profit margins. I researched Blackwood Development Corporation while my coffee grew cold, discovering that Pine Lake Resort Phase 1 had been operating profitably for 3 years, generating millions in annual revenue from upscale accommodations and marina services. Phase 2 expansion would require optimal water access and unobstructed views from premium suites, exactly what Serena had been documenting during her unauthorized survey of my property. The surveyor finished his work with military precision, packing expensive equipment, while Serena made final notations on clipboards full of technical data. Before leaving, she photographed my bridge from multiple angles, clearly documenting sightline obstruction and building evidence to justify eliminating whatever stood between her and her next development project. As their vehicles disappeared down the winding lake road, I remained at my window with growing unease about what I just witnessed. My bridge had become a multi-million-dollar problem for someone with the resources and motivation to solve it permanently. I thought about the permits I'd obtained 15 years ago, the environmental impact assessments I completed, the careful attention I'd paid to setback requirements and wildlife protection. Everything had been done properly through official channels, with my bridge grandfathered under regulations that predated any HOA authority over waterfront structures. But watching Serena study my property with the calculating expression of someone solving a business problem, I realized legal compliance might not be her primary concern. She had the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted through political connections and financial leverage, regardless of property rights or existing permits. The professional surveying equipment, architectural plans, and systematic documentation of my bridge as an obstruction pointed to a carefully planned campaign to clear obstacles from her corporate expansion path. I reviewed the video on my phone one final time, understanding that I just documented the opening move in what would become something much larger than a simple HOA dispute. Serena Blackwood had identified my bridge as the primary obstacle to her multi-million-dollar development project, and she was clearly prepared to take whatever action necessary to remove it from her path to increase profits. What she didn't realize was that her surveying expedition had just been documented by someone with the authority to turn her million-dollar dreams into a very expensive nightmare. The legal threat arrived exactly 10 days after Serena's surveying expedition. Hartwell and Associates, law firm specialists in corporate development law with offices in 3 states, had sent 3 pages of dense legal language demanding voluntary removal of my bridge within 30 days. The letter cited waterfront safety standards and planned community improvements with sophisticated legal phrasing that cost serious money. This wasn't some HOA volunteer typing angry emails. Serena had escalated to the kind of firm that cleared regulatory obstacles for resort chains and luxury developers, complete with manufactured environmental compliance requirements that sounded official but felt entirely disconnected from any actual HOA authority. The letter referenced upcoming resort expansion requiring unobstructed waterfront views, as if my property somehow fell under resort jurisdiction. I spread county records across my kitchen table that evening, applying the methodical approach that had served me well in 20 years of water management, and discovered the scope of Serena's ambitions extended far beyond removing one inconvenient bridge. Pine Lake Resort Phase 2 expansion permits projected additional revenue exceeding $4 million once construction was complete, transforming our quiet residential community into a commercial tourist destination. The plans included luxury condominiums, a conference center, and exclusive recreational facilities that would fundamentally alter Pine Lake's character while forcing longtime residents to choose between skyrocketing property taxes and selling to developers. Serena wasn't just targeting my bridge. She was systematically reshaping the entire lakefront for corporate profit. I pulled up topographical surveys from the State Water Authority database using my professional access to review lake depth charts and water management protocols. What I discovered made me smile for the first time since receiving her legal threat. Pine Lake Resort's entire marina infrastructure was designed around maintaining minimum water levels of 843 feet above sea level. Drop the water below that threshold, and their multi-million-dollar dock systems would become expensive lawn ornaments sitting in mud. More importantly, water level management fell under exclusive state water authority jurisdiction, specifically my department. The irony crystallized with perfect clarity. Serena had spent months maneuvering to remove one small bridge, apparently never researching who actually controlled the water levels. Her entire resort empire depended upon for survival. Her legal team had focused on property rights and HOA authority while ignoring the regulatory framework governing lake management systems. She'd made a fundamental miscalculation in her corporate strategy. Several phone calls that evening revealed corruption networks supporting her development plans. Blackwood Development Corporation had applied for expedited permits through channels that bypassed normal environmental review, leveraging political connections. I was only beginning to understand. County commissioners had received substantial campaign donations from Serena's company building. Inspectors had somehow expedited approval processes that normally required months to complete, and sheriff deputies had been instructed not to respond to noise complaints from Pine Lake residents questioning resort expansion. Mrs. Fletcher knocked on my door around 8 that evening, looking nervous in the way that had become common among neighbors since Serena's election as HOA president. Margaret Fletcher was 72 years old, a retired school teacher who'd lived on Pine Lake longer than anyone else in our community, and she rarely visited neighbors unannounced without good reason. "Nathan, I hope you don't mind the intrusion," she said, glancing around as if expecting surveillance. "But I needed to warn you about something. Serena's been making promises to people, telling them property values will increase dramatically once the resort expansion is complete. She's convinced several families to sign agreements supporting her development plans, promising them marina jobs and increased home equity. Not everyone understands what they're actually agreeing to support." Margaret explained that Serena had divided the community strategically, offering financial incentives to families struggling economically while applying legal pressure to others who might resist. The HOA president position gave her access to homeowner financial information, allowing her to identify which neighbors could be bought and which would require more aggressive persuasion. My bridge had become a symbol of resistance to her broader agenda, making me a target for particularly focused attention. "She is not just trying to remove your bridge," Margaret continued quietly. "She's testing whether anyone in this community has the resources and determination to fight back against corporate development. If she succeeds with you, the rest of us don't stand a chance against what she's planning for the entire lakefront." After Margaret left, I returned to my research with renewed focus and a growing sense of strategic possibility. County records confirm that Serena's transformation of Pine Lake would proceed methodically, removing obstacles one by one until no resident possessed the financial resources or legal standing to challenge corporate development. But she'd chosen the wrong obstacle for her opening move. I pulled up the State Water Authority Emergency Protocols Manual and reviewed Section 12. 3 Environmental Response Procedures for Contaminated Water Systems. Any evidence of unauthorized shoreline modification or illegal dredging activities could trigger immediate water level adjustments pending full environmental assessment. The legal authority was broad, oversight was minimal, and potential impact on downstream facilities was entirely at the supervising engineer's discretion. Pine Lake's dam system allowed controlled drainage from 847 foot down to 831 feet above sea level, a range that could render shallow marina areas completely unusable while remaining within normal operational parameters. Environmental justification was broadly defined. Implementation required only a single authorization code from a senior hydrological engineer, and the legal framework protected emergency decisions from corporate interference or political pressure. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unlisted number. last chance to remove bridge voluntarily before we explore alternative solutions. Community progress shouldn't be delayed by individual selfishness. The message was unsigned, but the tone was unmistakably Serena's. She was escalating from legal pressure to direct intimidation, suggesting that voluntary compliance was preferable to whatever enforcement methods she had prepared. I made one final notation in my research files and closed my laptop with a sense of clarity that felt almost predatory. Serena Blackwood had built her corporate strategy around the assumption that individual property owners lacked the resources and authority to challenge well-funded development projects. Her legal team had researched property rights, HOA bylaws, and local political influence, while completely ignoring the regulatory agencies that control the natural resources her business empire depended upon for profitable operation. The shift in my thinking was subtle but fundamental. For 10 days, I had been responding defensively to threats against my property and bridge. Now, I understood that Serena's aggressive tactics had placed her entire multi-million-dollar resort operation in a position of extraordinary vulnerability. She controlled local politics and legal pressure. But I controlled something far more essential to her success: the water itself. Her carefully orchestrated campaign to remove obstacles to community progress had made an enemy of the one person who possessed the authority to drain her empire overnight. The second wave of pressure arrived with sophisticated fraud designed to intimidate property owners into compliance. County Environmental Safety Office letterhead demanded immediate removal of my bridge due to emergency environmental hazard and potential dam overflow issues, complete with government seals and regulatory citations that looked convincing enough to fool most residents. A quick phone call to the real county environmental office confirmed what I suspected. No such department existed anywhere in our regulatory system. Serena had escalated into outright impersonation of government agencies, a federal crime that suggested either desperation or supreme confidence in her local political protection. Heavy machinery erupted from the lakefront at 6 o'clock that morning. While I was processing this revelation, through my bedroom window, I watched Blackwood development trucks begin work operations on property directly adjacent to mine. Excavators, bulldozers, and cement trucks had somehow gained access to lakefront areas that should have required months of environmental review before any construction permits were approved. The noise was intentionally aggressive, designed to make normal life impossible, while demonstrating Serena's determination to proceed with Phase 2 expansion regardless of regulatory compliance. Serena appeared on site around 7:30, wearing a hard hat and carrying blueprints directing operations, like someone accustomed to managing major development projects. She pointedly ignored my presence 50 feet away, but her body language conveyed satisfaction with the psychological pressure her machinery was creating. I documented everything from my deck while drinking coffee that tasted like metal, maintaining the professional approach that had served me well in previous crisis situations. The permit situation revealed corruption extending far beyond local HOA politics. Blackwood Development had somehow obtained building permits for marina expansion through channels that bypass normal environmental review processes entirely. County commissioners, who had received substantial campaign donations from Serena's company, had apparently expedited approval for construction that would normally require 6 months of impact assessments. Sheriff deputies weren't responding to noise complaints from residents, and property assessors had begun questioning land boundaries for homeowners who expressed concerns about resort expansion. I spent my lunch break researching the construction activities through state water authority databases, discovering violations of numerous federal environmental regulations that carried serious criminal penalties. Blackwood Development was conducting unauthorized dredging operations that could destabilize dam systems and disrupt local ecosystems, while their shoreline modification work was eliminating vegetation that prevented erosion and protected wildlife habitats. None of this had been approved through proper channels, with the Army Corps of Engineers or Environmental Protection Agency creating a paper trail of violations that would interest federal enforcement agencies. That afternoon, local media escalated the pressure campaign with a front-page article about dangerous waterfront structures that threatened community safety. The piece was clearly paid placement written without any actual investigation or expert consultation. My 15-year-old bridge built to code with all permits properly obtained was characterized as an imminent hazard requiring emergency removal for public protection. The accompanying petition contained signatures belonging to people who'd moved away from Pine Lake years earlier, while others appeared to be forgeries based on handwriting analysis. The escalation reached its peak during that evening's county commissioners' meeting. I attended specifically to question the expedited permit process for Blackwood Development's marina expansion, bringing documentation about unauthorized environmental work and fake government letters. Serena was prepared for my appearance armed with her own presentation about community improvement projects and economic development benefits. Mr. Cross represents the kind of individual selfishness that prevents community progress, she announced to the packed meeting room. His refusal to cooperate with legitimate safety improvements endangers everyone who lives on Pine Lake. We're dealing with someone who prioritizes personal convenience over environmental protection and community welfare. The irony of her environmental protection claims, given the illegal dredging operations happening at that moment, was apparently lost on commissioners who'd been well compensated for their cooperation. I responded calmly, asking specific questions about permit timelines and environmental review processes that Serena couldn't answer without revealing the corruption underlying her expedited approvals. Her evasiveness became obvious to anyone paying attention, but the commissioners appeared determined to support her development agenda regardless of legal compliance or resident concerns. Driving home from the meeting, I discovered something far more alarming than continued construction noise. Blackwood Development crews had installed temporary fencing around portions of my property, including barriers that blocked access to my bridge. A foreman approached with official-looking paperwork claiming my bridge now fell within a construction zone for public safety that required immediate access restrictions. The work order bore county letterhead and looked legitimate, but I recognized the same sophisticated fraud techniques used in the fake environmental safety letter. Serena was systematically isolating my bridge from normal use while positioning heavy demolition equipment within striking distance of the structure itself. Excavators capable of destroying my bridge in minutes were parked just beyond my property line, ostensibly for legitimate construction purposes, but clearly positioned for rapid deployment. I photographed everything methodically, documenting equipment placement and fraudulent work orders, while maintaining the calm professionalism that had served me well in water management crisis. The foreman clearly expected confrontation or legal threats, but I simply thanked him for the information and walked back to my house. The construction equipment represented a clear threat, but it also confirmed that Serena was operating outside legal authority in ways that could trigger serious federal enforcement actions. Her fake government letters, unauthorized environmental work, and fraudulent permits created evidence that would interest agencies with jurisdiction over corporate environmental crimes. She had escalated beyond local political corruption into federal violations that couldn't be resolved through campaign donations. That evening, I reviewed emergency water management protocols with renewed focus, understanding that Serena's environmental violations had provided sufficient justification for immediate action under federal emergency response authority. The shift in my thinking was fundamental. For weeks, I'd been responding defensively to legal threats and corporate pressure. Now I understood that her aggressive tactics had systematically violated environmental laws that fell directly under my professional jurisdiction, creating an opportunity for decisive action that would end her harassment permanently. Her escalation into direct property interference suggested she was prepared to use whatever force necessary to remove obstacles to her development timeline. But she had no idea that her environmental crimes had just handed me the legal authority to drain her empire completely. I woke at 5:30 that Thursday morning to the distinctive rumble of heavy machinery starting up in darkness. The sound was wrong for normal construction schedules, too early, and too aggressive for legitimate work activities. Through my bedroom window, I could see floodlights illuminating my lakefront property with the harsh glare of a night operation designed for speed rather than subtlety. Blackwood Development had apparently decided that voluntary compliance was taking too long for their Phase 2 timeline. My 15 years of peaceful morning routines ended in the next 60 seconds. An excavator positioned itself directly beside my bridge while Dale Brennan, Serena's construction foreman, began methodical demolition of the structure I'd built with my own hands during early retirement. The machine's hydraulic arm moved with practiced efficiency, grabbing wooden planks and support beams that represented countless weekends of careful craftsmanship. Everything I created was being reduced to floating debris with the mechanical destruction of corporate expediency. Serena stood 30 feet away in a hard hat and safety vest, directing the operation with the composed ruthlessness of a CEO orchestrating a hostile takeover. She held a clipboard and walkie-talkie like instruments of authority, communicating with legal team members and county officials through professional radio equipment while watching my life's work disappear with obvious satisfaction. Her body language conveyed complete control over the situation, from overnight permit manipulation to the psychological impact of destroying my property, while I watched from my bedroom window. I pulled out my phone and began recording everything from multiple camera angles, maintaining the documentation discipline that had served me well in water management emergencies. The excavator operator followed precise instructions, dismantling my bridge section by section rather than simply pushing it into the lake. This wasn't random vandalism. It was calculated elimination of an obstacle that interfered with sightlines from premium resort accommodations. Instead of rushing outside to confront the demolition crew, I made several phone calls with the calm professionalism that emergency situations had always demanded from my engineering background. "This is Cross," I said to the first number on my emergency contact list. "Yes, they're doing it now. Activate Protocol 7 immediately. Full documentation package will follow within the hour." The voice confirmed receipt and implementation timeline, then disconnected without requiring additional explanation. The emergency demolition order that Dale Brennan showed me when I finally walked outside had been issued by county officials sometime after midnight, citing imminent structural failure and public safety concerns that required immediate intervention. The paperwork looked official enough, complete with engineering assessments that had somehow been conducted and approved during hours when no legitimate inspectors would have been available for emergency evaluations. "Nothing personal, Mr. Cross," Dale explained, while his excavator continued destroying 15 years of my retirement project. "We're just following county orders about unsafe structures. Nobody wants anyone getting hurt if this thing collapses." His tone suggested genuine belief in the safety justification, indicating that Serena had convinced her crew they were performing legitimate emergency remediation rather than corporate-motivated property destruction. I watched my bridge disappear with the detached fascination of someone observing a technical process rather than personal devastation. Each wooden plank that had supported countless peaceful mornings floated away from shore like fragments of a life that was ending according to someone else's timeline. The craftsmanship that had earned compliments from neighbors and visiting grandchildren was being systematically erased to improve water views from luxury accommodations. When the final support beam snapped and my bridge collapsed completely into Pine Lake, something cold and final settled in my chest. 15 years of weekend mornings, coffee cups shared with visiting family, quiet evenings watching wildlife. all of it reduced to debris floating toward the far shore. For exactly 30 seconds, I felt the weight of genuine loss, the kind that comes when something irreplaceable disappears forever. Then the engineer in me reasserted control, and I began calculating the precise cost Serena would pay for this moment of corporate triumph. By 7 o'clock that morning, my bridge had been completely eliminated from Pine Lake's waterfront landscape. The excavator operator packed his equipment with military efficiency, while Serena made final notations on paperwork that documented successful completion of her emergency safety project. Lake surface debris provided the only evidence that anything had ever existed in this location. Serena approached my property line with the confident stride of someone who just solved a significant business problem. That's what happens when people don't cooperate with community improvement projects. "Mr. Cross," she announced with obvious satisfaction. "Individual selfishness can't be allowed to delay progress that benefits everyone who lives on Pine Lake. Resort Phase 2, construction starts Monday morning, and we won't tolerate any further interference with legitimate development activities." I responded with the calm professionalism that had carried me through 20 years of water management crisis. "Thank you for making this so thoroughly documented, Miss Blackwood. Phase 2 construction, you said, starting Monday." The question seemed to surprise her, given that she'd expected either emotional breakdown or legal threats rather than technical inquiry about her construction schedule. "Pine Lake Resort Marina will be operational by Christmas," she continued with obvious pride in her project management capabilities. "For $2 million in new investment, creating jobs and increasing property values for everyone in this community. People who understand progress will benefit significantly from these improvements." I walked back to my house and opened my laptop with a sense of clarity that felt almost predatory. The demolition of my bridge had provided exactly the documentation I needed to implement emergency protocols that would render Serena's $4.2 million investment completely worthless within 48 hours. Her aggressive tactics had crossed legal boundaries that triggered federal environmental enforcement authority it possessed, but had never needed to exercise. Incident report: unauthorized destruction of private property with environmental impact. I typed into the State Water Authority Emergency Response System recommend immediate water level adjustment per emergency protocol section 12.3. Environmental contamination from illegal construction activities requires assessment period of indefinite duration pending full regulatory review. The report generated automatic notifications to federal agencies with jurisdiction over environmental crimes. I paused before typing the final line that would activate emergency procedures Serena had never researched during her legal preparation. Estimated impact to downstream facilities $4 million plus. Authorization: Nathan Cross, Senior Hydrological Engineer. The irony wasn't lost on me that Serena's own corporate announcements had provided precise financial projections for the damage her environmental violations would trigger. The shift in power dynamics was complete and irreversible. For weeks, I'd been responding defensively to legal threats and corporate intimidation. Now, I understood that Serena's destruction of my property had provided federal environmental justification for emergency actions that would destroy her business empire more thoroughly than any excavator could eliminate a wooden bridge. What happened next would prove that corporate arrogance and environmental law make for a very dangerous combination, especially when the person you've just made into an enemy happens to control the one thing your multi-million-dollar empire cannot survive without. The drive to the State Water Control Authority office that Friday morning felt different from my usual commute. For 20 years, I'd made this trip as a senior hydrological engineer, managing routine water system maintenance and regulatory compliance issues. Today, I was driving there to implement emergency protocols that would destroy a multi-million-dollar corporate empire in less than 48 hours. The weight of that authority had never felt more tangible than it did during the 30-minute drive through rural county roads. I badged into the building at exactly 8:15. My security clearance granting immediate access to restricted areas where few people were authorized to operate independently. The Dam Control Center occupied the entire third floor, housing sophisticated monitoring equipment that tracked water levels, flow rates, and environmental conditions across 12 major lake systems in our region. Pine Lake was among the smaller systems under our jurisdiction, but the regulatory authority was identical regardless of size or economic impact. My first priority was documenting the environmental violations that would justify emergency water level adjustments under Federal Clean Water Act enforcement procedures. I pulled up Blackwood Development's construction activities from our monitoring database, cross-referencing satellite imagery with permit applications to establish a clear timeline of unauthorized environmental modification. The evidence was overwhelming. Unpermitted dredging operations, shoreline vegetation removal, and sediment disruption that violated multiple federal regulations designed to protect aquatic ecosystems. I reviewed Pine Lake's operational parameters with the methodical approach that had guided my career in water management. Normal water levels maintained 847 feet above sea level, but dam controls allowed reduction to 831 feet during emergency situations requiring environmental assessment. The 16 feet operational range provided extensive flexibility for addressing environmental threats while remaining within established safety parameters. Pine Lake Resort's marina infrastructure had been designed around maintaining minimum water levels of 843 feet above sea level. Engineering specifications filed with their original construction permits clearly indicated that lower water levels would render their boat slips, floating docks, and waterfront amenities completely unusable. A 12 OT reduction would expose concrete foundations, eliminate boat access, and transform their premium lakefront accommodations into expensive structures overlooking mud flats. The legal framework supporting emergency intervention was elegantly simple. State Code 7842 granted senior hydrological engineers sole discretion during environmental emergencies, with federal environmental law superseding corporate interests regardless of political influence or financial leverage. Serena's months of legal maneuvering and local corruption meant nothing against regulatory authority that operated independently of county commissioners and campaign donations. I calculated the timeline with engineering precision that left no room for miscalculation. Water level reduction of 8 in per hour would reach critical thresholds for resort operations within 18 hours, with complete marina exposure occurring by Thursday morning. The process was gradual enough to prevent environmental damage, while being rapid enough to create immediate operational crisis for any business dependent on maintaining specific water levels. I opened the emergency response terminal and began typing the authorization that would activate protocols Serena had never known existed. Emergency water level reduction. Environmental contamination response. Authorization: Nathan Cross, Senior Hydrological Engineer. Duration: indefinite, pending full environmental assessment. Estimated timeline: minimum 30 days, maximum 6 months, depending on extent of ecological damage. The system generated automatic notifications to federal agencies, creating an official record that would protect my decision from corporate legal challenges. I activated the dam control sequence with a single keystroke, watching water level sensors respond immediately to my commands, 847, 2 feet, and dropping with automated systems, maintaining controlled reduction that would continue until manually overridden by authorized personnel. The process was irreversible once initiated, protected by environmental law that placed ecological protection above corporate financial interests. Meanwhile, 20 m away at Pine Lake Resort, Serena was celebrating her successful elimination of obstacles to Phase 2 development. Security footage from our environmental monitoring cameras showed her touring premium lakefront suites with potential investors highlighting the unobstructed water views that my bridge removal had created. Construction crews were preparing marina expansion activities scheduled to begin Monday morning, completely unaware that their work site would be exposed lake bottom by Thursday. I established automated monitoring alerts to track reduction progress while maintaining normal office routines that wouldn't attract attention to my emergency response activities. The technical monitoring data provided real-time confirmation that my calculations were proceeding exactly as projected. Water levels dropped steadily throughout the morning with sensors indicating optimal flow rates and controlled reduction that systematically exposed shallow areas where Blackwood Development had conducted illegal construction activities. I spent my lunch break reviewing public records of Serena's resort financing arrangements, discovering that her Phase 2 expansion was heavily leveraged against projected marina revenues that required maintaining specific water levels for operational viability. Bank loans exceeding $3 million had been secured using marina infrastructure as collateral, creating financial obligations that would become problematic once her boat slips became inaccessible to customers paying premium prices. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text message from Mrs. Fletcher. Serena's at the resort bar celebrating with champagne, bragging to investors about removing obstacles to progress. Says Phase 2 will be the most profitable development project in county history. Thought you should know she's feeling pretty confident about her success. The timing was perfect. Serena's celebration would make the eventual revelation even more devastating. The beauty of environmental enforcement authority was its independence from local political influence and corporate pressure. Once initiated, emergency protocols continued automatically until environmental threats were resolved to federal standards, regardless of economic impact on downstream businesses. By noon, the process had become irreversible without my personal authorization code, which I had no intention of providing. I locked the dam control system with my personal authorization code before leaving the office that evening, ensuring that only I possessed the authority to modify emergency protocols once they were fully implemented. The water level reduction would continue automatically throughout the weekend, reaching critical thresholds for resort operations by Monday morning when Serena expected to begin her triumphant Phase 2 construction activities. As I drove home through the same rural county roads, I felt the satisfaction of someone who just implemented a solution that was both legally bulletproof and poetically appropriate. Serena had destroyed my bridge to clear obstacles from her corporate expansion plans, apparently never researching whether the person she'd made into an enemy possessed the authority to drain the very resource her empire depended upon for survival. The elegance of the situation was undeniable. Environmental law enforcement operated with minimal oversight and maximum authority to implement immediate protective measures. By the time Serena realized what was happening, her multi-million-dollar resort would already be sitting high and dry on exposed lake bottom that no amount of political influence could refill. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of Serena's education in the difference between local political power and federal environmental authority. A lesson that would cost her everything she'd spent years building on Pine Lake. 24 hours after I activated dam controls, Pine Lake looked like a construction disaster that had been abandoned mid-project. Water levels had dropped 10 feet overnight, exposing concrete marina foundations, boat ramp infrastructure, and acres of lake bottom that should have been hidden beneath pristine water. Pine Lake Resort's $4 million marina sat stranded on mud flats, like expensive playground equipment installed in the wrong location, completely unusable for any boat larger than a canoe. My morning coffee tasted better than it had in weeks, as I reviewed automated monitoring reports confirming that water reduction was proceeding exactly according to my calculations. Floating docks that had supported luxury boats worth hundreds of thousands of dollars now rested on exposed sediment, their anchor systems visible above the receded water line. The resort's boat slips, which generated premium revenue from wealthy guests expecting lakefront accommodations, were now concrete channels leading nowhere except deeper into muddy lake bottom. Serena's phone had been ringing non-stop since 6 o'clock that morning, according to Mrs. Fletcher, who'd positioned herself strategically to observe the crisis unfolding at Pine Lake Resort. Wedding receptions scheduled for the weekend were being canceled as brides discovered that their premium lakefront venues now overlooked exposed construction debris rather than sparkling water. Conference bookings worth tens of thousands of dollars were evaporating as corporate clients realized their luxury retreat had become an environmental eyesore overnight. The financial hemorrhaging was immediate and catastrophic. Resort operations were losing $15,000 daily in missed bookings, with marina boat slip revenues completely eliminated for the foreseeable future. Phase 2 investors were demanding explanations for the temporary water shortage that had somehow transformed their multi-million-dollar lakefront investment into waterfront property without water. Insurance claims were being denied under active government exclusions that protected companies from regulatory actions taken by environmental authorities. Around noon, Serena made her first desperate attempt to restore normalcy by calling county offices about dam malfunction and demanding immediate emergency repairs. City engineers calmly informed her that water levels were controlled exclusively by state water authority jurisdiction, and that county governments possessed no authority over federal environmental enforcement actions. Blackwood development contractors refused to continue marina expansion work, explaining that underwater infrastructure couldn't be installed on dry land regardless of construction deadlines. The media discovered the story by afternoon, with local television crews filming empty boat slips and expensive watercraft sitting on trailers in resort parking lots. Environmental groups immediately praised the swift action to protect water quality, while business reporters began investigating the financial implications for a resort empire built around water access that no longer existed. Headlines read, "State drains lake to address environmental contamination at luxury resort," framing Serena's crisis as environmental enforcement rather than regulatory overreach. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Serena's desperation drove her to demand a meeting at State Water Control Authority offices. I watched through security monitors as she arrived in her luxury SUV, wearing the kind of power suit that suggested someone accustomed to intimidating government employees into reversing inconvenient decisions. Her confidence appeared intact despite the financial disaster unfolding at her resort, suggesting she still believed political influence could override environmental law. I met with Serena in my official capacity, wearing my state authority uniform and carrying comprehensive legal documentation that outlined federal environmental violations triggering emergency response protocols. The conference room setting reinforced the power dynamic shift that had occurred since our last interaction. She was now a corporate executive requesting government assistance rather than an HOA president wielding local political authority against individual property owners. "This is about the bridge," she declared immediately, her composure finally cracking under financial pressure that threatened everything she'd built over the past decade. "You're destroying my business for personal revenge, and I'll sue the state for abuse of governmental power." Her accusation revealed fundamental misunderstanding of environmental enforcement procedures that operated independently of personal motivations or corporate financial interests. I responded with the professional detachment that federal environmental law demanded. "This is environmental enforcement triggered by unauthorized dredging and shoreline modification activities, documented through our monitoring systems. Your bridge destruction provided additional evidence of environmental violations requiring immediate assessment and remediation." The legal framework was bulletproof, supported by federal agencies that had already confirmed jurisdiction over contaminated sediment removal and ecosystem protection. Serena's desperation intensified as she realized that political connections and legal pressure had no influence over environmental emergency protocols. "Environmental law takes precedence over private business interests," I explained calmly, presenting water quality data showing contamination from illegal construction activities. Assessment timeline is minimum 30 days, potentially extending to 6 months depending on ecological damage extent. The technical language was precise and uncompromising, designed to convey the finality of decisions made under federal environmental authority. Her threats of lawsuits and political intervention revealed how completely she'd misunderstood the regulatory framework governing her business operations. Environmental protection superseded corporate interests regardless of financial impact or local political influence, and emergency protocols continued automatically until environmental threats were resolved to federal standards. No amount of campaign donations or expedited permits could restore water levels that had been reduced for ecological protection purposes. The meeting concluded with Serena's recognition that her corporate empire was entirely dependent on resources controlled by the very person she'd chosen to make into an enemy. Her legal team could file appeals and challenge environmental findings, but federal law protected emergency decisions from corporate interference. The water would remain at reduced levels until I personally authorized restoration, which I had no intention of providing until environmental violations were fully remediated. As Serena left the building, I could see the weight of financial reality settling over her corporate confidence. Phone calls were likely coming from bank loan officers questioning collateral values, investors demanding explanations for project delays, and contractors seeking payment for work that could no longer be completed. Her resort empire was hemorrhaging money with every hour that Pine Lake remained at emergency water levels. That evening's news coverage cemented public perception that environmental enforcement had revealed serious ecological violations at a luxury resort that prioritized profits over environmental protection. Documentary crews were already playing features about corporate environmental crimes, while environmental law schools began developing case studies around Pine Lake's enforcement actions. Serena's reputation as a successful developer was being replaced by notoriety as someone whose greed had triggered federal environmental intervention. The beautiful irony was undeniable. Serena had spent months eliminating obstacles to her corporate expansion, never realizing that her aggressive tactics had made an enemy of the one person who possessed authority to drain her entire empire overnight. Her destruction of my bridge had provided the environmental justification necessary to implement emergency protocols that would cost her everything she'd spent years building on Pine Lake. By the time she realized the true scope of her miscalculation, her $4 million resort was already sitting high and dry on exposed lake bottom that no amount of political influence could refill. 1 week after I drained Pine Lake, Serena's corporate empire officially collapsed under the weight of financial obligations that could no longer be sustained without operational marina revenue. Blackwood Development Corporation filed for bankruptcy protection on Wednesday morning, unable to meet loan payments exceeding $4.2 million that had been secured against now worthless marina infrastructure sitting exposed on dried lake bottom. The bank moved to foreclose on resort property within hours. Recognizing that collateral values had evaporated along with the water that once made Pine Lake Resort a profitable luxury destination, the media feeding frenzy began immediately, with investigative reporters discovering a pattern of environmental violations and political corruption that extended far beyond my bridge destruction. County newspapers ran headlines like "Local Resort Developer Ignored Environmental Laws for Years," while television features explored how one woman's greed destroyed her $1 million resort empire. Environmental journalists uncovered Blackwood Development's history of permit violations at other locations, revealing systematic disregard for federal regulations in pursuit of accelerated development timelines and maximum profit extraction. Social media amplified the story nationally, with environmental groups sharing aerial footage of the drained resort as evidence that corporate environmental crimes would face serious consequences regardless of political connections or financial resources. The hashtag trending locally became a symbol of grassroots satisfaction, with seeing wealthy developers face accountability for regulatory violations that had been ignored by corrupt local officials for years. Federal law enforcement escalated the situation beyond local political influence when FBI Environmental Crime Unit investigators arrived at Pine Lake on Friday morning. Their investigation focused on systematic violations of Clean Water Act provisions, unauthorized modification of protected waterways, and potential conspiracy charges related to the fraudulent government documents that Serena had used to justify destroying my bridge. Agent Rodriguez informed me that environmental crimes carried substantial prison sentences, particularly when combined with government impersonation and conspiracy to defraud regulatory agencies. The FBI investigation revealed corruption networks, enabling Serena's environmental violations through expedited permits, bypassing federal oversight. 3 county commissioners receiving Blackwood Development donations were placed on administrative leave, while the building inspector, who expedited marina permits, was terminated after investigators discovered he'd never conducted required site inspections. Community revelations emerged as neighbors felt safe speaking publicly about years of intimidation. Mrs. Fletcher revealed Serena had threatened her with property tax reassessments if she opposed resort expansion, while other residents came forward with stories of promised jobs and financial incentives designed to purchase community support for projects benefiting corporate interests rather than longtime residents. HOA financial audit uncovered $18,000 in community funds that Serena diverted to personal legal expenses, triggering additional criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. Community members realized they'd been systematically manipulated by corporate interests disguised as neighborhood leadership, with association funds financing legal attacks against residents opposing commercial exploitation. State ethics boards investigated permit processes enabling Blackwood Development to bypass regulations through political influence. The Attorney General filed civil suits demanding restitution for environmental damage and seeking permanent injunctions, preventing future development by companies with regulatory violation records. Serena made one final desperate attempt, filing federal lawsuits claiming economic terrorism against the State Water Authority. Her legal team argued environmental enforcement was motivated by personal revenge, seeking emergency injunctions forcing water level restoration. The strategy reflected fundamental misunderstanding of environmental law enforcement procedures operating independently of personal motivations. Federal Judge Martinez dismissed Serena's lawsuit within 48 hours, ruling environmental protection supersedes private business interests regardless of economic impact. The judge noted plaintiffs' illegal activities triggered enforcement action, and emergency protocols were designed to be immune from corporate legal challenges. The dismissal was swift, decisive, and publicly humiliating. I maintained professional stance throughout media attention. When reporters asked about personal motivations, I responded, "This is environmental law enforcement. Personal disputes don't factor into regulatory decisions protecting natural resources." State Water Authority backed my actions completely. Financial devastation was comprehensive. Resort property values dropped from $8 million to $2 million due to absent marina infrastructure, while Blackwood Development stock became worthless. Contractors were owed $600,000 in unpaid bills, creating additional legal pressure. Paradoxically, enforcement improved conditions for Pine Lake residents. Residential property values increased 15% as the community gained reputation for environmental stewardship. Environmental groups requested Pine Lake become a case study, while other HOA communities asked me to consult on governance reforms, preventing corporate manipulation. Pine Lake evolved from quiet community under corporate threat into nationally recognized environmental law enforcement success. Residents expressed pride in the lake where one man stood up to corporate greed, attracting tourism and environmental education programs, providing sustainable benefits without compromising residential character. That evening, as Serena sat outside the bankrupt resort, staring at dismantled marina infrastructure, FBI Environmental Crime Unit investigators called about federal charges for environmental crimes documented through her construction activities. Serena finally understood her destruction of obstacles had made an enemy of the one person possessing authority to drain her empire permanently. 6 months after Pine Lake Resort's collapse, Serena Blackwood stood before federal Judge Martinez to receive her sentence for environmental crimes meticulously documented through her own construction activities. 18 months in federal prison plus $400,000 in fines represented the final collapse of a corporate empire that had once generated millions in annual revenue. The woman who destroyed my bridge while bragging about community progress now faced federal imprisonment for environmental violations her aggressive tactics had created. Blackwood Development Corporation was completely dissolved. Its assets liquidated to pay creditors who recovered only 60% of what they were owed. The resort property was sold to the state park system for $2.3 million, less than half its original value, and would be transformed into a public recreational area focused on environmental education. Serena's personal assets, including luxury vehicles, jewelry, and vacation properties, were seized to satisfy federal restitution requirements. The FBI investigation uncovered systematic corruption, resulting in resignation of 3 county commissioners and termination of building inspectors who had accepted bribes to expedite permits without proper environmental review. State oversight reforms were implemented to prevent future development projects from bypassing federal regulations through local political influence, creating lasting systemic changes, protecting natural resources from corporate exploitation. My vindication came through official recognition that environmental enforcement had been conducted properly. The State Environmental Protection Award recognized my exemplar enforcement action that prevented ecological damage while holding corporate violators accountable. Water Authority leadership promoted me to Senior Regional Director, acknowledging my emergency response demonstrated the effectiveness of federal environmental law. National media coverage transformed the Pine Lake case into a template for environmental enforcement success. Environmental law schools incorporated our enforcement timeline into curricula as an example of how government employees could protect natural resources from corporate criminals regardless of political pressure. The story became required reading for federal environmental enforcement training programs. Pine Lake community experienced remarkable transformation as residents embraced environmental stewardship leadership. Property values increased 15% as the area gained reputation for successfully resisting commercial exploitation while maintaining residential character. The community attracted tourism, environmental education programs, and sustainable economic development, providing lasting benefits. I built a new bridge using my own funds, creating a structure larger and more beautiful than the original, while incorporating environmental features, enhancing local wildlife habitat. Community volunteers helped with construction, transforming the project into neighborhood celebration of resilience. The bridge plaque read, "Pine Lake Community Bridge, rebuilt 2024 in memory of what we almost lost to greed." Environmental groups celebrated Pine Lake as a model for watershed management. Federal grants totaling $500,000 supported continued environmental protection and monitoring programs, ensuring long-term ecological health while providing educational opportunities. Wildlife populations recovered dramatically, with osprey nesting and fish populations reaching levels not seen in decades. The documentary The Dam That Drained a Resort won Environmental Film Awards and reached national audiences, spreading awareness of corporate environmental crimes while highlighting federal enforcement effectiveness. Harvard Business School developed a case study, "When Greed Meets Environmental Law," examining financial consequences of ignoring federal regulations. Dale Brennan, the construction foreman who demolished my original bridge, completed environmental compliance training and began a new career as environmental inspector, helping construction companies avoid regulatory violations that destroyed Blackwood development. Every morning, I sat on my new bridge with coffee watching sunrise over restored Pine Lake while neighbors waved with respect. The harassment, legal threats, and corporate intimidation had ended, completely replaced by community appreciation for someone who used proper government authority to protect shared natural resources. The personal satisfaction was profound. I had never sought revenge against Serena Blackwood, but simply used environmental law as intended to protect ecosystems from corporate exploitation. Her destruction of my bridge provided environmental justification to implement emergency protocols exposing her systematic regulatory violations, leading to federal prosecution and corporate collapse. Sometimes, the most effective response to corporate bullying is allowing the legal system to function perfectly, demonstrating that environmental crimes carry serious consequences regardless of political connections or financial resources. Serena had destroyed herself through her own illegal activities. I had simply ensured she couldn't escape the consequences that federal environmental law demanded for corporate criminals who prioritize profits over ecological protection. The view from my new bridge confirmed that justice, when properly applied through federal environmental authority, creates outcomes more satisfying than any personal revenge could achieve. Sometimes, the most effective response to corporate bullying is allowing the legal system to function perfectly. That's another story from QA Stories, where justice prevails through proper channels. Hit that like button if you enjoyed seeing environmental law in action. Until next time, stay strong and see you soon. At QA Stories, we don't just tell stories, we let the chaos speak for itself. If this one blew your mind, wait till you see what's